Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Mission in Geneva. I want to thank you all for coming to this on-the-record press briefing with Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello.
I've heard worse.
Who is here in Switzerland to launch this urgent international effort to end the crisis in Sudan. Before turning the microphone over to the Special Envoy, just a couple of quick points about the run of show. Mr. Perriello will provide a few opening remarks to get us started. We'll have approximately 45 minutes for questions, so there's lots of opportunities for you to get your questions out there. When we get to that part, I ask that you please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question and state your name and affiliation. So, without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ted, and thank you to all of you for being here. The crisis in Sudan is a crisis of epic proportions, but the coverage by the media and by many around the world has not been sufficient to that. So for all of those who take time to pay attention to this crisis is very important to us. We're at a time where tens of millions of Sudanese face either full-on starvation or acute hunger. There are more refugees and displaced people than the entire population of Switzerland, just from Sudan alone right now. And we continue to see city after city besieged, atrocities against women on a daily basis, crimes against children, and the cries over and over again from the Sudanese people that they feel has not been sufficiently heard by the international community. And that's why President Biden and Secretary Blinken made clear the importance of us moving forward with this initiative, building on the Jeddah process and the partnership with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, now also co-hosted by the Swiss here, with an effort to convene the parties for mediation, but also to convene key regional actors on looking for making sure we are exhausting every tool we have to address the famine, the move towards an increasingly fractured conflict, and the war itself. We would have preferred for these talks to start in April, when we began trying for this round, if not April, May, if not May, June, then July. But we will move forward with this event this week, and that has been made clear to the parties. We have had a commitment and engagement from the RSF. We've had extensive engagement with the SAF, but they have not yet given us an affirmation, which would be necessary today for moving forward with seating them on the 14th. We will move forward with every effort possible with our international partners to reach an action plan, a concrete action plan about how we can advance that cessation of violence and the full humanitarian access and a monitoring and enforcement mechanism. These are long past due. We will continue to build forward. We could do more together if SAF commits to arriving with the kind of delegation that can make decisions. We would prefer that option, and we will build back in mediation of the parties if they choose to do so. But the message from the Sudanese people has been clear. They want the international community to do more on humanitarian aid and access. They want the international community to do more on pushing for a cessation of violence. And we have heard those cries from the Sudanese people in event after event. I hear and meet with thousands of Sudanese every day, both inside and outside of Sudan, both virtually and in person. And while there are many divisions in this war, the Sudanese people are incredibly united in their desire for this war to end, their desire for the parties to come to these talks, and for the desire for there to be humanitarian access to all 18 states and a mechanism of enforcement. The United States has long stood with the Sudanese people on a bipartisan basis, and we continue to see that reflected both from the White House and from Congress. We also will concurrently have an event sponsored by our Ambassador for Gender and Women's Issues, Ambassador Rao Gupta, who is here with us, continuing to meet with Sudanese women, who will also have an opportunity to meet directly with me as the mediator, and where we will continue to engage with Sudanese civilians as we have before. While that's not a formal role in the mediation itself, which is between the warring parties, it is certainly something that we have prioritized. And what I've been most touched by since the invitations to the formal mediation were issued is that we have literally had more than 100,000 Sudanese reach out and engage in some way or another in their position on talks, whether that's been through social media, whether that's been through various stakeholder roundtables, and it has been overwhelmingly positive in support of moving forward with this mediation in these talks. It is still our goal to do everything we can, along with our Swiss and Saudi co-hosts and the participation of Egypt, the UAE, the African Union, the UN, that we can make progress this week. The other group that has been so incredibly, we have seen such an incredible outpouring from another group in addition to the Sudanese people, and that's technical experts. People who are on the ground in the shadows, nameless, faceless, people of courage. They're trying to get food and medicine into besieged villages, coming out saying, hey, if you could do this or that, it would make an enormous difference in saving lives. And those technical experts, whether they're here physically or feeding in from around the world, have just been an inspiration to us on the kinds of incremental gains, in addition to looking for broader efforts to ensure we get food and medicine forward. And each one of those things may sound incremental to us, but that's lives saved. And when we think about over half the people in the country are affected by this conflict, affecting some sort of scarcity and displacement, that's thinking about half of your family members. That's thinking about half of your neighbors, half of the people you know in the world who are directly and acutely affected by this conflict. And the international community has not done enough. Again, we stand prepared to include the formal mediation with the parties. We believe that would be in the best interests of the Sudanese people. But we are going to go forward with all of the effort and urgency we hear from the Sudanese people on trying to deliver concrete results. And because the international community has fallen far short of meeting the standard, the truth is there's much more to be done. And I think that's what the Sudanese people will expect of us. So we are incredibly appreciative of this work. One last point is that, in the room with the collection of actors we have, it's building from a Jeddah process, but also, Manama and many other efforts, the Cairo and EGAD processes, and trying to learn lessons from each of these efforts. And the truth is the people in the room have spent months and months consulting directly with SAF and with RSF. When I think about the amount of work the Egyptians have put in, not just in supporting this mediation and engagement efforts, their inclusive political conference and otherwise, our Saudi partners who just hosted me in Jeddah in the last couple of days, when I think about the work that the UN did here under Ambassador Lamamra on working on many of these technical issues on ceasefire, the African Union has been essential in its efforts, both at political dialogue, but also its clear advocacy for ending this conflict and ensuring access. The UAE is a key partner, particularly as SAF and others raised the issue of the enforceability of any agreement. So we're very excited this week both to have Ambassador Rao Gupta here, working with this amazing group of Sudanese women, working with our partners to do what we can here to bring attention, but most importantly to bring action to the crisis in Sudan. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that overview and for framing the crisis. To kick off the Q&A, actually, I'd like to read a question from Sudan TV journalist Suzanne Soliman, who is en route to Geneva for this briefing but was unable to make it in time. So the first question: what is the U.S. vision for Sudan's future amid the current challenges? How can the U.S. pressure the warring parties to ceasefire and allow unimpeded humanitarian access?
So first of all, I think the vision we have of Sudan's future is an inspiring one, and it's a vision that was written by the Sudanese people, particularly back in 2019, when an incredibly diverse set of people, including many women and youth, as well as some of the armed forces currently in this struggle, helped overthrow an authoritarian regime and really said, we want to control our own future. And that's what we hear over and over again. The Sudanese people want control over their future. And in the path to that, they want to not live in the fear of terror the fear of maternity hospitals being shelled, of hunger, and all the things that one turns to when they're facing that hunger. So in the near term, it's very clear that that vision is an absence from war, but not just an absence from war and from hunger, but the kind of inclusive democracy and representation the Sudanese people have wanted for a long time, and that hasn't changed. And we stand with the Sudanese people in that long-term vision and hopefully near-term vision. But we also understand at this point there's a particular urgency around issues of starvation, issues of daily bombing and shelling, and of a desire for that war to end. We also are very thankful to the many neighboring countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, others that, indirectly, that have taken in millions of refugees. But what we know is most of those, the vast majority of Sudanese want to return home. They just want to be able to return home for safety. On the humanitarian issue, we have been very clear about being willing to sanction both sides, not just individuals, but companies and entities that are aiding and abetting with atrocities, as well as efforts to limit humanitarian access. We will continue to raise the costs and the consequences to actors who stand in the way of the basics of international humanitarian law. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN has worked with our African counterparts to strengthen pressure from the United Nations on the interests of international humanitarian aid, and quite frankly, the importance of having the aid itself there. And the United States has contributed over $1 billion since the war began to that humanitarian aid effort. We appreciate that the French, the Germans, the EU held the conference in Paris. We got an update today that well over half of those pledges have actually moved into the field, and we need those efforts to continue.
Let's start right here in the front row with AFP.
Hi, Agnès Pedrero, AFP, here in Geneva. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. I wanted to ask you how much confident you are that the talks will happen this week, even you mentioned there is a lack of confirmation from one side. And will you move forward if only one side is present?
So we are 100% confident that this will proceed. We will launch these efforts on August 14th with our partners. As I said, we will not be able to do in-person mediated talks with the parties if the parties are not there, even if one party is not there. So if we continue to be in a situation where SAF is not committed to the process, we will draw on the partnerships and consultations that got us here, focus on the international and regional roadmap, working with many of the people who have, countries and multilaterals that have been most intensely engaged in trying to solve this crisis, to work on what we can do together for cessation of violence and humanitarian access, and again, convening these technical experts, many from the region, as well as from here, who can really dig into where we can find breakthroughs that get food and medicine and civilian protection to people who live in fear every day. One of the places that I think there's broad agreement is needing to do a better job on enforcement of existing agreements, whether that's the Jeddah agreements or the basics of international humanitarian law. And that's certainly something we've consulted with the parties on, but not just us. You know, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and others have spent months talking to the SAF and other parties about what is essential for getting to a cessation of violence. So this is a tremendous gathering of experts, and we are going to move forward. If SAF changes its mind and wants to participate, we will then be able to add back in the mediated component. But we are we are 100% sure that we will move forward, as the Sudanese people have asked us to do, with every effort we can to provide support to cessation of violence, humanitarian access, and enforcement.
Jamie from AP in the back, please.
Hi, sir. Thank you for coming to see us. Jamie, Associated Press. I was wondering if you could just give us a quick breakdown on the main points that were raised by military and government delegation in Jeddah. Just give us a flavor as to what has come out of that. And just a quick question, but from the U.S. perspective, has the United States called on the RSF to lift its siege on Al-Fashir city in Darfur? And if so, what was the response?
Sure. We have, let me take those in reverse order. The United States has been extremely clear from the beginning of the siege of El Fasher that the RSF needed to stand down from that siege. It was very important for us to call it that and make clear that the RSF had created the crisis in El Fasher and not do a both sides statement. We were also able to communicate direct consequences of those attacks, and particularly any repeat of the kind of ethnic cleansing we had seen in other areas. And we spent 4 weeks trying to negotiate a local ceasefire and humanitarian access agreement between the parties. And we will continue to be very focused on anything we can do to get relief and protection to the people of El Fasher. We also recognize that that is one of, perhaps one of the more acute, but nonetheless not the only crisis around the country, and that we need to be thinking about how to get food and medicine to all 18 states. We need to be thinking about options that may not have been considered earlier, from airdrops of medicine to looking at infrastructure protection to just ongoing issues in so many different cities. And I think that's why we've seen this unbelievable outpouring from both the Sudanese people, who are glad that we're trying everything we can on this, and from so many humanitarian experts around the world who can bring to bear experience from earlier challenges in Sudan and from other conflicts. And we want to just draw on that knowledge and be a place where we can bring that together. I won't comment much on what was covered in the with the delegation sent from Port Sudan in respect for the discretion of our mediation. I know not all have followed those same rules, but what I can say is that we are very clear that the priority in this process is to reach that cessation of hostilities, civilian protection, humanitarian access, and enforcement, and that this is not the place for the political dialogue that the Sudanese people believe should be an inclusive political dialogue, not driven by these actors. And I will say that when you introduce politicians into the equation, you can waste hours and hours and hours on things that have nothing whatsoever to do with ending the violence or increasing humanitarian aid. We have made clear that in keeping with ceasefire negotiations around the world, there's a reason why you invite fighting parties in their military or militia capacity, and why that leads to the practicalities that I think the Sudanese people want from their leaders. So I will not comment more on the substance of that, but I will say we are very, very serious about welcoming a senior staff delegation that has decision-making authority in the room in order to move forward at the pace we think is needed to reflect the crisis facing the Sudanese people, and not have something where there's a back and forth with 2 days of breaks every time you need to negotiate some small aspect of these conversations. And I think that's what the Sudanese people want to see.
Laurent Siro from the Swiss news agency. Thanks for that press briefing. First, SAF tend to put into question the participation of UAE as an observer and the existence of a platform outside of Jeddah. If they don't show up, are you ready to change again the format and go back to Jeddah, or is it a process here from Geneva that you want to keep on? And second question, so you mentioned an action plan towards ceasefire. What could be a first confidence-building measure? Thank you.
So the SAF spent months rejecting Jeddah and delaying Jeddah, so I think it's of limited credibility when they choose to focus on this issue. Now, we see this as an extension of Jeddah, as do our Saudi co-hosts. What we know is that we can draw on the fundamentals of what worked in that case and with that partnership, while also building in other strengths. And those strengths, I think, are also responsive to issues SAF has raised, including the issue of enforcement. And I think it's very clear that having Egypt and UAE at the table is an incredibly important potential tool for ensuring not just there's a deal on paper, but if those are present and witnessing to each other, they can become more like guarantors for the kinds of outcomes the Sudanese people have asked for. Ceasefire negotiations are less a matter of higher perfect principles. They are often very pragmatic negotiations about saving lives, and that's, again, why this is guardrailed from the political process, in keeping with what the Sudanese people, particularly women and youth, have been very clear about. They do not want their future bargained away at the ceasefire tables. This is about belligerents coming together to stop the violence, while the AU and Egypt and others continue to pursue the kind of inclusive political dialogue that the people want.
I want to make sure that I'm being equitable here. We'll go to the front row.
Hi, Yusuf, Global Media. Thank you for giving Sudanese people this opportunity to stop the conflict. My question is, why you are moving intensively right now to stop the war in Sudan, despite your knowledge of serious violations and killing, displacement since April 2023?
It's a great question, and the answer is very simple. We wanted to start the talks in April. When we couldn't get SAF to agree in April, we wanted to have the talks in May. When we couldn't have them in May, we tried for June, and then July, and here we are in August. And that's why we are going to proceed with every effort we can, even if SAF is not willing to come to the table. We hope they are. But this crisis should have been solved months ago, and it should have never happened in the first place. That's a failure by all of us as friends of Sudan. But it was very clear from the White House and Secretary Blinken that we could not continue to delay these talks, and that the trajectory of those delays were not to the benefit of the Sudanese people. Quite frankly, I don't think they were to the benefit of SAF either, but I will leave that to their judgment. What was clear was, for our priorities of standing with the Sudanese people, continuing to allow further delays meant lives lost, and we, again, would prefer to pursue full mediation with the parties, and we would welcome SAF's commitment to that at any point. But we are going to go forward and do the best we can with very strong partnerships that we have in the region, across the continent, with multilateral actors, including many actors that will not have a formal role as observers here, but have been a huge part of this effort, whether that's an IGAD or Arab League or the European Union that continues to be tremendous support. All of those really are people that are advising on this. And we are appreciative of that. So yesterday would have been better than today. Today is better than tomorrow.
Let's go back over to the side here. Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Schlein, Voice of America. A few things. First, to make sure, is the RSF delegation here in town? And how long do you anticipate these talks will be going on? Now, since the RSF is here, I'd like to know what is the best outcome that you can imagine for these talks. Since the SAF is not here, clearly ceasefire is off the table. Are you hoping for some kind of humanitarian access? And especially if the RSF is here, they control what is happening around Al-Bashar, the famine situation. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, let me just clarify, the RSF has committed to coming, but they are not here, at least not as far as I know. But they have committed to participating if there's a commitment from SAF. We will continue to look at all of those options and keep all options open with SAF. Again, one cannot do a formal mediation between two parties if one or more of those parties is not present. But we, as I said, will continue to go for very bold efforts on an international plan of action around cessation of violence and around humanitarian access. There are many things that we can do and contribute in that way. I think that we would like to put together a very comprehensive humanitarian access plan that would be presented back to the parties potentially. We'll need to work with the heads of delegation on that. But I want to be clear, this isn't starting from scratch. You know, Ambassador Lamamra was here working on efforts just a few weeks ago. Many countries, including the European Union and its members, have been working on this. And most importantly, the international humanitarian experts who you all know well in this city have been begging for breakthroughs on key issues of humanitarian access and civilian protection. And those are things that that can be shared back to the parties. Those can be brought to the UN. They can be brought to the African Union. What is clear and what we felt was most important is that we could not afford for August to be a month where people go to sleep on Sudan. It needs to be the month we all wake up on Sudan. And we are going to be moving forward with these concrete actions along with key partners in the regions and multilaterals. And we will look for every opportunity possible for producing results. And again, we think those results would be stronger and closer to what the Sudanese people want if we see the senior staff delegation arrive and we can include the mediation within that. But otherwise, we will pursue the priorities I mentioned.
I'm sorry, I'm not clear on what these concrete actions are.
Well, that's why we're getting together to figure out what the plan is. But I think, how can I help with that?
I don't know. I mean, something escapes me here. You talk about concrete actions. You have experts here. Who are the experts? I mean, how many do you have here? And they have different agendas, I would imagine. So you could perhaps...
Not really.
No,
I mean,
don't.
it's actually amazing. I mean, first of all, I think that we have to remember how united the Sudanese people are. It's obviously very polarizing in war on a number of questions, including political questions. But on the question of whether food and medicine should be able to reach all 18 states, the Sudanese people are incredibly united. On wanting to silence the guns, people are incredibly united. And there are countless humanitarian experts and workers on the ground who have answers to the question, what is it that we could do to continue to make a difference on the ground? Now, are there many cases in which the SAF and the RSF are barriers to that? Yes. And that is where the international actors assembled can be part of the question of how we break through those barriers. But there are also places where the international community needs to muscle up itself and make more commitments, as we saw in Paris. So anything that gets more aid to the region, that creates more opportunities for getting that aid to the people most in need, where we need to consider alternative mechanisms of getting aid in given the conditions, and where we need to consider additional carrots and sticks that can help to ensure that people who are starving to death can get food. So I think the question isn't whether there are action steps. I think the question is, what do we have the political will to do? And I think this is an opportunity for us to try to answer those questions for the Sudanese people, including where that engagement with SAF and RSF are essential for moving those things forward.
I'm going to take one more from the right side over here before coming back to the left side.
Thank you very much. Musaasi Al Mayadeen TV, Arabic News Channel. The Sudanese government in Khartoum rejects the participation of United Arab Emirates in these talks. Why the Emirates Arab invited to this talk? And you have an alternative if this round of talks is failure, is not given a good result? Thank you.
So on the first question, frankly, we just think this is a very missed opportunity for the SAF, that actually sitting down with the UAE can be an important part of finding breakthroughs forward and can be an important part of enforcing both past and future agreements. And I think that we believe that building out the kind of regional commitment to peace right now, including the United States' willingness to use a lot of its diplomatic weight to encourage that alignment, is a good thing. I think unlike even more than a year ago, when this was just a humanitarian crisis, it is both a much greater humanitarian crisis, but it's also a regional stability threat at this point. Again, for us, the human rights and humanitarian aspects are the most pronounced, but this is becoming something that's destabilizing the entire region. And I think that creates an opportunity to ensure that countries in the region that are in a position to help be a source of stability and peace are encouraged to do so and given the opportunity to do so. In terms of the issue of these talks, again, they are going to go forward. They will, and they aren't. They will be iterative. They are building from the Jeddah process, both Jeddah processes before, as well as trying to draw lessons from, efforts by the Egyptians and Manama and other efforts. So this is part of a an ongoing effort for us to work with partners to see every opportunity we can. Again, we're looking for a national cessation of hostilities and a national plan on humanitarian aid. If we only find some incremental places, that can still save dozens of lives, hundreds of lives, thousands of lives, while reducing terror in certain areas. So we will look for developments both small and large that we can have come out of this. I think it is unlikely that we will solve every problem this week. And so the question of what comes next is we need to continue to look at everything. We aren't doing enough, all of us. So certainly the upcoming meeting of the UN General Assembly is one opportunity to continue to draw attention and, more importantly, galvanize action for Sudan, but also efforts ongoing in the region, whether that's the Arab League's consultative group, whether that's the African Union's expanded mechanism. I have been, there can be a lot about this job that drains hope. But one of the reasons for hope is first and foremost the courage of the Sudanese people, but also the number of actors in the region who really want to be part of helping Sudan get back to a peaceful, stable, and democratic future. And we're going to remain available as a partner to those who wish that. I'll try to give shorter answers so we can do more.
Go right here in the front row.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Abdullah Massi from Al Arabi TV. I do have two questions. One is now the talks will start after tomorrow on Wednesday. Have you arrived to set up a final program for those talks? Also, where will take place?
A final program for, sorry, what?
For this talks. And where they will take place. And my second question is, where is the United Nations in this talks? Is there any endorsement, UN endorsement, also any position in favor or against from the Security Council, especially from P5? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The United Nations is a participant, a very active participant, as an observer under Ambassador Lamamra's leadership, who is the special representative of the Secretary General. They also have been supplying a great deal of technical expertise and our thinking, particularly on some of the humanitarian access issues. But he's also been a very significant player in the region, engaging with not just the actors inside Sudan, but across the region, and brings a tremendous amount of history. We also have a number of the UN agencies who will be engaged, again, both formally and informally. I can't stress enough how much we now live in a virtual world, and our ability to draw on expertise is not limited by geography in the same ways. So our ability, for example, to consult directly with many people inside Sudan it exists for security reasons. We will only highlight that on a limited basis. So the UN, both represented by Ambassador Lamamra, but also more generally working with us on a number of these technical questions, both in person and beyond. And the same thing is true with something like the event with Sudanese women that Ambassador Rao Gupta is putting on. We have a number of partners from across Europe and elsewhere that are engaged in that. The African Union has done an event recently in Kampala with Sudanese women, as well as other organizations, and really wanting this to be a drawing together of some of those expertise this week. One of the reasons that we proceeded with the talks, of course, mostly was the urgency on the ground, but we'd also heard more and more from Sudanese civilians in recent months that there'd been sort of a closing of space for Sudanese voices to speak up, particularly pro-peace voices. And people said, we need something to galvanize around. And sure enough, when the news of the invitations went out, the response was just overwhelming from the Sudanese in calling out their leaders to go to the talks and to be part of this mediation. And it's been inspiring to see the creativity and the viral campaigns. And this includes, for example, a lot of the leading pro-SAF voices and influencers online who see this very much as an opportunity for SAF, which I think is the view of most of the Sudanese people. Again, I defer to their leadership for their decision-making, but we see it as an opportunity, first and foremost for the Sudanese people, but also for the sides. So we will continue to look for those opportunities, but the UN is certainly a key partner. On the program, again, I think you know what the priorities are. It's anything that we can do towards the cessation of hostilities, towards humanitarian aid, and towards enforcement. There'll be a number of working groups and other things that you would expect. Nothing that that would be particularly exciting to share, but we will be looking for that process at the same time that the heads of delegation, will be engaged really in the question of what's possible. So I think we have to have a sense of what's possible. And again, I think between the delegations that are coming, you have months and months of direct engagement with SAF and RSF on issues related to cessation of violence, peace, also the political process, which is not part of this effort, but is another concurrent effort. The political dialogue is separate from the dialogue of the mediation of the parties. And we'll leave it at that.
One more on this side back here.
Thank you. My name is Christiana with the German press agency. Can you tell us where these talks take place? And also, how long do you expect them to last? How long will you personally be here in Geneva? And did I hear just a few questions ago that you said RSF has agreed to come if SAF also comes? Is there a possibility that the talks open on Wednesday with neither of them being here? Thank you.
So on location for security reasons, we're not going to disclose a lot of the details on that, but we are very appreciative to the Swiss government for hosting and making this possible. And I don't know whether the location of some of the other events are public, probably not. So there's some security risks involved or concerns involved in that. Again, the RSF gave an unconditional agreement to participate, and the question earlier was whether they're here, and my understanding is that they are not here, and that we would not be able to proceed with formal mediation between the two parties if SAF does not attend, in which case we would continue to focus on the international and technical elements. Where we have the need to engage the parties, we obviously can do that in the modern age with telephones and other mechanisms, so it doesn't mean that there is no ability to continue with ongoing communication. And again, we'll see from SAF whether or not their answer develops over time. But again, we will proceed in the way we've discussed. Oh, how long? So the talks start on the 14th up to the 24th. So it'll be up to 10 days on the first round, then with a break and potentially continuing. I think that depending on the nature of the agenda, it may be different lengths of time. So I think what we will do, particularly given the dynamism of the format, is work with the heads of delegation once they arrive to understand what we think is possible in terms of very concrete steps that will make a difference in the lives of the Sudanese people, and figure out how long it takes, and we'll stay as long as it's required. And I would love to stay longer because it's beautiful.
Let's go back over to the side. Nick?
Yeah, Nick Cumming-Bruce, New York Times. Without being too geospecific, can you confirm that the talks are essentially going to be in Geneva, number one? Number two, could you just talk a little bit about the mechanics? If staff do show up, have you invited them to face-to-face talks, or are these going to be proximity talks? How do you expect that to go forward? And one last question. How important do you think the whole issue of arms supplies is to progress on the issue of cessation of hostilities? And particularly, arms supplies, including allegedly by states like the UAE who are participating here. Have you been able to make any progress on this issue hitherto? Thanks.
So it was location, arms supplies, and what was the third?
The first one was Geneva.
And what was the middle one then? Proximity, yes. Okay, so on the first question, I'm not going to comment. I'm not sure what constitutes the the greater Geneva area. But I will just say that we are here in Switzerland. I am here in Geneva, and we are excited for delegations to arrive. I think on the question of proximity talks, this was a topic of conversation in the consultations with the parties. It is our view that at least some in-person conversation gives us by far the best opportunity to make progress, and that can take a variety of forms. But that will be something that we continue to look at in the context of whether there's a confirmation of participation. We have insisted again that it is a SAF delegation in best practices for ceasefire talks everywhere, and the importance of focusing in on the actual issues at hand, and that it has to be senior enough to make decisions. This is the intention here was very much to have the parties together, not to build up to one big deal, but to be looking at where we can get agreement, maybe multiple agreements a day. That was our hope, and we believe that would be the most valuable way to build momentum that can make a difference and save lives in Sudan. But again, we're a couple steps away from that side on the mediation, given where we are with one of the parties in particular. I will also say that while RSF deserves to be acknowledged in their willingness to come to the party and to come to the talks at a senior level, one of the things that is difficult to do without SAF saying yes is to test how serious they are about negotiating a deal and complying with a deal. And frankly, we think that's a question that we and the Sudanese people want to know the answer to. And again, that's been made more difficult by the months of delay from one party. The issue of arms supply is incredibly important, and we have been active on that both in the United Nations and elsewhere, and looking at the existing arms embargo and how to enforce it on Darfur, as well as other opportunities to do so. And we continue to try to raise the costs on anyone who is fueling this conflict. But I think it is a central aspect of exacerbating the problem. I also believe that even if we were to see significant progress there, some people believe the conflict would magically go away. It would be much better if we could shut down those arms supplies, but we still need the parties to come together and find that roadmap back to a cessation of violence, and one that we believe is not a power-sharing arrangement between the two sides. And again, it's an important issue. It's one we'll continue to look at enforcement on with both the United Nations and the AU. I imagine it will be a topic that is discussed very much this week.
Okay, staying on this side of the room.
Jean Musy, Radio Zone, Radio Française. In this negotiation, is now the partition or separation of Sudan is on the line? If yes, do you agree? If not, is it a way to solve the conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a quick one. No, partition is not on the table. Partition would be a disaster on multiple levels for Sudan. I believe that is a position shared by all of the participants. And we believe that protecting the sovereignty and unity of Sudan at this point is essential. We do see, unfortunately, that the trajectory of the conflict is one that could make issues of failed state, failed institutions, continued factionalization, drawing in of regional countries with overlapping tribal or ethnic groups, increased introduction of extremist actors, whether foreign fighters from across the Sahel or engagement from Iran and others on the SAF side. These are all very negative trends, and these are trends that are incredibly concerning to the Sudanese people as well as to key regional actors, including the possibility of a de facto partition that we absolutely would oppose. And I think that is a unified feeling of most in the region and the international community. All the more reason why we need the parties to come to talks to make sure that we can at least pause this violence and and get humanitarian access and not continue this trajectory towards very negative outcomes.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. Bastian Benred with Bloomberg, hi. I have two questions. First of all, have you given up on the hope that the SAF will come? And if not, how how much do you gauge the likelihood that they will still show up? Second question, if you do reach a peace deal or ceasefire, how will that be enforced? Like, are there any thoughts on that yet? Like, will there international troops be involved? Who will send them? These kinds of things. Thank you.
Thanks. So on the first question, we have not given up hope that SAF will attend the talks. I think that, frankly, it's a great opportunity in terms of the actors here to pursue the mediation to a cessation of violence and humanitarian access. I believe that President Burhan understands that we have heard out many of the concerns that were raised, and that the situation right now is very, very serious. We will respect his sovereign decision to come or not come, and I think he understands our decision to proceed because our White House and Secretary of State have heard from the Sudanese people that they want us to do more on cessation of violence and humanitarian access. So while we will go forward, as I said, we can do far more together, and our hope is that we will see them come to the table in a meaningful way. And again, whether it's SAF or RSF, really getting to Switzerland should be the easy part, thanks to our Swiss hosts and our co-hosts from Saudi Arabia. The real issue is, are they in a mindset to make progress on issues large and small that could protect thousands of lives, maybe millions of lives inside of Sudan, even as there are massive overarching issues that will be not solved or unlikely to be solved in this particular context. One of the best examples of why I think it's important or valuable for SAF to come to the table is the question about enforcement. We have been trying to draw from them more of their ideas of what they think could produce the enforceability of previous agreements, notably the Jeddah agreements, and there have been violations of those agreements by both sides, as well as basic compliance with international humanitarian law and whatever we could produce here as new agreements. So we think this is a reason to come together and see. We've built a set of actors around these talks, as well as many more that have been part of shaping it. Certainly among those, Egypt has played an outsized role in helping to build momentum towards this kind of a mediation process in terms of their inclusive political dialogue, in terms of lots and lots of engagement, as well as accepting over 1 million refugees into the country. So we think that this is an opportunity, and we hope it will be taken.
Great. Let's go back to this side.
Thank you. Isolda Gassi, La Liberté, it's a Swiss newspaper. To my knowledge, the reason why SAF is reluctant to come is, in addition to what Laurent Serrault said before, it's also because they want to be recognized as the Sudanese official government, on the one hand, and also because they would like some armed groups from Darfur to participate. First of all, if this is correct, that's correct. I don't know if it's correct. What is your position on that? Is it something that you accept?
So I think one of the challenges is that the terms and conditions have changed many times over the last few months in many different formats. We've been very clear that we support the African Union's inclusive political dialogue for the key political questions about the transitions going forward, but that ceasefire discussions are a practical negotiation between warring parties. And in that capacity, we were inviting the top from each side that has command authority, because that's how ceasefires tend to be organized. And in that case, that's Burhan in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief and General Hameti, and that those invitations do not bestow or deny any legitimacy to the parties. It's meant to be a practical matter of coming to the parties to negotiate. That's how this is traditionally done, and that's how we've proceeded. That's how both previous Jeddah arguments were done. I will say I think there are some very negative actors in Sudan right now who are trying to put the political answers ahead of the cessation of violence efforts, because they know they do not have any popular support from the Sudanese people, and they are trying to backdoor into power by taking advantage of the Sudanese when they're most vulnerable, and they actually have an interest in the war being prolonged so that they can take advantage of that vulnerability for political power. And I think that is something that the Sudanese people do not appreciate. I think what they do want is to see the war stopped while the inclusive political dialogue goes forward. And that is yet another reason why ceasefire negotiations tend to be between two sides in their military capacity. And we think SAF will be best represented by having that SAF-led senior leadership.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
Sebastian Rausbeck, Swiss Television. Thank you for the opportunity. The United States is in the lead of this process. You have two co-hosts, Saudi Arabia and Sudan. Can you maybe say something specifically about the role of the co-hosts, and if maybe one possibility would be more different co-hosts in order to bring this process forward?
So first, I just want to express the deepest of appreciation for both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the government of Switzerland for their co-hosting capacities. I think it was fitting that I was in Jeddah just the last few days, where our partnership with Saudi Arabia has been such a key part of the Jeddah process, and now that that Jeddah process evolves into this round, the generosity of the Swiss to host, I think, has been essential, particularly with such a strong focus on the international humanitarian elements, as well as the enforcement elements, seems fitting to be done here. We see also that there's, for those who are other players that are involved, a very active role. I mentioned Egypt earlier. They are not just observers, but substantively deeply involved in both the preparations for this event and consultations and mediation, and will be going forward. And I think this is where we're drawing on knowledge, history, relationships, and lines of communication that are important to have in the room, particularly if the parties are not there, in order to be able to put together the kinds of deals that can make a difference going forward. So the co-host role has been great. I think really, in some cases, we want observers to become guarantors, but you can't be a guarantor of a deal you don't know. So the hope is that if the enforcement is the key, we are going to want commitments, not just from people in the room, but from many around the world, to these efforts. And I think we can do that, again, when we have deals in place that people can figure out, governments and multilaterals can figure out their role to play. And this just comes back to why we're here in the first place, and I think why President Biden and Secretary Blinken have put such an emphasis since my arrival in particular of elevating our willingness to lead, co-lead, support, play whatever role we can play to be responsive to the Sudanese people who are suffering beyond scale that is imaginable to most of us, and feel like they've been screaming into the wind with nobody hearing. And we've had moments of engagement from the world, from Paris and the Europeans around the April 15th, from efforts that I've mentioned, from Manama to the Egypt conference, et cetera. This is a time where we want more of the world's attention on the crisis in Sudan. We want more of the world's resources supporting humanitarian aid. We want more of the political will to help with enforcement and help with making sure food and medicine gets to the region and gets into these areas that are under siege. To get telecom reopened. I mean, you have people who don't even know if their families are alive or not, haven't talked to them in months. It's 2024 and people don't even know, can't communicate with relatives. They'll go months and weeks just assuming the worst, and unfortunately often finding out the worst was correct. We have, cities besieged. We have women attacked. We have millions of people facing acute hunger, starvation. We have starvation in 2024. For us, we have a long history with the Sudanese people, and we want to make sure we are doing everything we can. And we are going to do that this week with some of our core partners, both those that are formally part of the process and many who've been helping along the way. And again, we can do far more if SAF chooses to come than not, but we will continue to try to exhaust every option we have to stand with the Sudanese people in this time of crisis, and not just in this time of crisis, but continue to be committed to that transition to the future that was so bright in 2019 of an inclusive democratic future where we can be talking about inclusive economic development instead of whether food and medicine can reach this city or that city. So we appreciate so much that our Saudi and Swiss co-hosts have helped to make this happen. We appreciate all the partners, both formal and otherwise, who've been part of this. We appreciate that Ambassador Rao Gupta has come to help lead this effort with Sudanese women, along with some of our counterparts. And we hope to be reporting back to you with real progress here in the coming days or week. Thank you very much.